Good morning. So thank you for coming to my talk. So password hashing, let me try to start with the reasons why I'm here and why we are developing better password hashing methods. Evernote, Living Social, Reputation.com. So earlier in July, Ubisoft, Bohemia, Nasdaq, Ubuntu. Okay, so you get the point. We have a big problem with password security. In all those cases, it's easier for an attacker to recover your password. Because ideally we should all use very strong passwords, 16 digits, random digits, but we don't. Maybe for extremely critical accounts, like your email account, maybe your Facebook account. But for example, I have some average security password that I use for average security sites. And in all those cases, my password would have been compromised. It's not a straightforward password, it's not a dictionary word, but the password crackers, they are very effective methods. And in all those cases, they would have succeeded. Why? Because organizations like Ubisoft or Nasdaq, they don't use the best practices, they don't use the best password hashing methods. So we used to address the problem just by ignoring the problem. We are blaming the users and saying, you're just stupid, you should use a 25-digit password, and that's your fault if you're hacked. And then we realized that not everybody can remember 10 or more random looking password of 16 digits, 16 characters. So one way to solve the problem is to protect the servers, protect the machines. And as a matter of fact, that fails in practice because the attack surface is extremely large. Very often it's attacked by SQL injection, but there's plenty of other type of attack that can be used to compromise the password hash database. Then what we'd like to do, what we're trying to do is to tackle the problem at the root. Not to prevent a compromise of the server, but to mitigate a compromise. So we make the assumption that the attacker has attacked the server, has compromised the list of hashes, and our job is to make as difficult as possible here to go from the hashes to the password. So going on that fails in practice at this point. Nobody really uses strong password hashing methods, but that's probably easier to fix because instead of solving many different problems, we just have to solve one specific problem. So we have to understand what is a strong password hashing method, what we understand by security, how to define this a bit formally in a more scientific way, and then to develop techniques that match those needs, those requirements. That's the point of this talk, and that's what I would like to present to you today. So first let me go through the most common methods, how not to hash a password. So the first one, which is very popular unfortunately, is not to hash anything. Some people are told that they should use a hash function to protect passwords, so they do things like this. So I don't know if you can understand what's going on here. So the guys are just storing the passwords in clear, and you send them your password, they fetch the clear password from the database, they hash it, they hash the password you send, and they compare the two. Okay, that doesn't help a lot. A much better approach that is not from the 60s but from the 70s to use a cryptographic hash. So when you hear the word cryptographic, you think about something extremely secure, you think about Bush-Nair, so it must be secure. That's maybe one of the problems, it's terminology. So cryptographic doesn't mean strong for passwords. So it solves one of the problems. It's a one-way function, so it means that given the hash you cannot invert it, you cannot go back to the password in a straightforward way. It's not invertible. But you can use two types of extremely efficient techniques, which are based on the fact that these functions, they are designed to be extremely fast. For example, on the latest Intel chip, with the Haswell microarchitectures, you take the SHA-1 hash function, it takes only 500 cycles approximately to hash a password of 8 bytes, of 8 characters. That means approximately 1 microsecond, even less than 1 microsecond. So it means that you can test literally millions of passwords per second. Millions. So what does it mean for the attacker? It means that if he has a fast computer, he can use brute force technique. So test all the passwords enumerate all the possible passwords with a given set of characters until one matches the hash that he found on the database. Something that's a bit more intelligent is to use dictionaries or lists that are constructed in such a way that they will only include strings that are likely to be passwords, not strings that will look completely random. What is also very effective is what is typically known as rainbow tables and more generally time memory trade-offs. Here the idea is that you pre-compute huge tables, gigabytes of data. It might take you weeks, actually months. But once you have computed those huge tables, it will take you just a couple of minutes to break a password, against a few hours in the first approach. So in the 80s, people, or later in the 70s, they found a better approach is to use a salt. So the idea here is extremely simple. The rainbow tables, the time memory trade-offs, they work on a specific function, maybe SHA-1 or MD5 or SHA-2. But if you use a different hash function for different users, it doesn't work because the pre-computation that you do, it's specific to a given function. So obviously, you don't have many different cryptographic primitives available. So what you will do is use an external parameter called a salt that will be used to simulate different functions. And from a theoretical point of view, if you just concatenate the salt to the password with proper domain separation, then you have exactly the same behavior as completely different functions. In cryptographic terms, they will emulate a random oracle. So a black box that returns a random value if you send her a request. So that solves the problem of rainbow tables, of time memory trade-offs, but not of dictionary attacks. So how to address this? To use a password hashing scheme. So here the idea is extremely simple again, is just make it slower, make it more difficult, more complicated, and just use more resources. So instead of computing 1 million of hashes per second, repeat the hash 10,000 times, so that instead of doing 1 million trials, you can just make 1,000 or 10,000 of those. So that not only solves the time memory trade-off, dictionary and brute force problem, but also it minimizes the advantage of attackers that use dedicated hardware or that use graphic cards or FPGAs. For example, in some FPGAs, the cost of accessing, reading, writing memory is relatively higher than in a CPU where you have now a few megabytes of L2 or L3 cache. And this is achieved by doing more arithmetic operations, so using the arithmetic more intensively, and doing more memory allocation, more reads and more writes. So let me give you a presentation of the three most common methods. PBKDF2, password-based key derivation number 2. So it was designed as a key derivation. It's essentially the same problem as password hashing. Is you take a password and you get something that's cryptographic, random looking. It's a standard. It was designed by some people at RSA, and it's used in things like iOS and Blackberries and GPG, TrueCrypt. When you give your TrueCrypt password, it's first doing maybe 10,000 iterations to check your password. But one problem with this is that it's extremely simple, but it uses no clever way to minimize the advantage of attackers. So that's why some people designed bcrypt in 1999, and it was really the first attempt to make something against efficient crackers, efficient attackers. They use 4K of memory, which is constantly accessed and modified. And the idea of the designers is to defeat the ASICs, so dedicated hardware fabricated especially to hack passwords. But one limitation of this is that you cannot parallelize it, which means that as a defender, if you have a multi-core CPU, if you have SMD instruction sets like SSC AVX2, you cannot exploit them to hash password, which means that you give an advantage to the attacker because you don't use all the potential of your hardware. But we should not blame the designers because in 1999, and then you were still using a single core with very small cache memory. There's using Twitter, Living Social, after they've been hacked, and in BSD because it was done by BSD people. So now really the state-of-the-art design is great. Maybe you've heard about it. It introduces this notion of memory half function. So the guy, Colin Percival, he really tried to have a formal scientific approach to the problem. He defined theorem, he proved theorems, use very scientific notation to make it really more rigorous than bcrypt. Unfortunately, it's much less popular than bcrypt for some of the reasons I will present a bit later. But I think it's used in Chromium in Litecoin as an alternative to SHA-256 and in Tarsnap, which is the system of Colin. So just to present very simply how it works. You first allocate a large array of memory and you initialize it with random values. Not randomly random, but generated pseudo-randomly from the password and the salt. The passwords are the seed and you fill this with random values. That's the first step. You store this in memory. And second step is you make unpredictable accesses. So here the idea is to force the storage of all these values. Since you cannot predict which element can be accessed, you really have to store everything to make it efficient. Okay. So what's cool is that when you think about it, you think about the problem, you don't know script, you will come up to this construction. So we really try to achieve this functionality in the simplest way as possible. But there's some issues, some limitations with script. If you look at the evolution of cryptographic primitive, there's always this stage where you make something very good, but you have thought a lot about it, so you end up with something very mathematical, very sophisticated. And the subsequent stage is maturity, where you make the same functionality, but in a minimalistic way with just the components that you need. So I believe that script has not reached this stage, and if you look at the specification, you'll notice that you have to implement many different procedures. On the left side, you have something called smix, which is an algorithm that takes a sub-function called runmix, which calls blockmix, which uses SALSA20/8, which is the core component of the stream cipher SALSA20, which was designed by Dan Bershine, which is a really cool cipher. And after doing this, you have to use mfcrypt. I don't want to explain what it is, which calls PBKDF2, the thing I presented just before, which is HMAC, a construction defined by, standard by NIST, which itself is calling SHA-256 as subcomponent. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 cryptographic primitives and 4 other constructions. All those guys, you have to write code for them, to debug them, and to test them. So you see the problem. Next problem may be more pragmatic is, let's say you're not an expert in password hashing, you're not an expert in cryptography, you just want to protect your web application using script because this crypto guy told you to do so. And then you look at how to use the best parameters for your system, for your hardware. So you'll notice there are 3 parameters, N, R, and P. So N is called the integer walk metric. R is the block size parameter. And P the parallelization parameter. This might give you an idea that P parameterizes the parallelism of script. But the first 2 ones, it's not very clear what they're doing. So what you will do next, you will go to Stack Overflow. You will ask a question, this application, what parameter can I use? There may be some people which are a bit creative and give you some random values, and more serious people will tell you just to look up at the slide of Colin and look at the parameters that he proposed. They were proposed in 2004 and they may not be the best for your application of today. So how do they really affect performance if you're interested in using script? So N and R, quite surprisingly, they have exactly the same effect for the defender for you. N and R, they actually define the computation time, number of arithmetic operations that you will do. So if you double the value of N, you double the number of basic operations. If you double the value of R, exactly the same. No change at all. Same for the memory. You have N times R times 128 bytes. So N and R, they have exactly the same effect in theory. So this plot here just shows that when you increase N on the x-axis, or if you increase Y on the y-axis, if you increase R on the y-axis, sorry, you have exactly the same effect on the actual time of competition. So the more red, the slower, and the more blue, the faster. Okay. And now maybe you are running your application on an embedded platform. Maybe you have some memory constraints. You just have maybe, I don't know, 1 meg of memory available. But you want to be slow. You don't have any latency constraint. So you want to be as slow as possible, maybe up to 1 or 2 seconds. But you don't want to use more than 1 meg of memory. You can do that with script. Because if you increase N or R, you will de facto increase memory as well. So then if you really dig into the specification, trying to understand how it works, and after 2 days of reading the paper again and again, you will figure out that if you modify the parallelism P, you will also indirectly modify the time, not the memory. But still, that's not a very user-friendly way, in my point of view. I have a very quick demo to show you what script is doing. Okay, so these are the values of n and r, the parameters. So 9, it takes 140 milliseconds. 10, so you see that it's multiplied by 4 approximately. And okay, so you see the linearity here. Now if you do the same measure for a range of parameters, okay, you can look at the htop. Okay, so if you use it with 10 and 11, you will use approximately 500 megs of memory. Now let's do 11 and 12. So N11 and R12. Look at the memory consumption and the CPU usage. Okay, about 1 gig. Now we do the other way around. N is 12, R is 11. About 1 gig used, and about the same time. So now to solve this problem, we are 10 minutes. Thank you. We are doing something about it. We want to solve this problem because too many people get hacked. We don't have the ambition to solve the general problem of SQL injection or server hacks. So we want to solve this password hashing problem, and that's why we're organizing a new competition, PHC password hashing competition. Maybe you're familiar with AES, SHA-3, maybe eStream. So these are open competitions where everyone can participate. And it was last year in December, so I'm not really from the password hashing scene, but I'm a cryptographer. And I was reading all those discussions about script, about bcrypt, about hashes that get hacked, and say, well, you guys have very interesting ideas, very good knowledge. Why don't we use all this knowledge and to construct something to solve the problem? And I was extremely happy to see that this community was extremely reactive. We have a panel of experts, including some of the top people when it comes to password cracking, to cryptography, software engineering. People like Jeremy Gosney, Matt Green, Peter Gutmann, Solar Designer, Zuko. So I'm extremely happy that all these people will work together to assess the quality of submission and to choose something that will be useful to solve the problem. So the timeline, we published a call for submission. We hope to receive many good submissions in Q1 2014, in January. Then people, me, you, everyone, will look at them, give their opinion on performance, security, simplicity, and eventually we'll make a selection of finalists. We'll analyze them again more intensively, and hopefully in Q2 2015 we'll give a final selection of one or more submissions. There might be one for web services, one for standard application, one for scripting languages. We don't know what we'll receive yet. Okay. So like AES, like SHA-3, the fun part of it is that the incentive scheme. So you submit something and you try to attack the others. Everyone's trying to attack everyone, but in a very healthy way, very scientific way. So I'm looking forward to probably very cool like SHA-3. If you're interested in submitting, so let me go through very briefly about what we expect from you. First of all, specification. How does it work? It should be comprehensive, complete. Basic security analysis. Why you believe that it's secure? What notion of security do you consider? How fast or how slow it is? Why do you think it's fast for the defenders and as slow as possible for the attackers? You should give us some reference code, because if you have the specification, there might still be some ambiguities, and C code is much easier as a reference. And an IP statement, we don't want to accept any submission that has any copyright or pending patent or royalty. It should be as open as possible. So you can look up https at passwordhashing.net, all the details. We have an FAQ, a timeline. So if you're interested. Now in the few minutes that I have, I'd like to talk about the technical challenges we're trying to solve. First one is crypto research. So I'm sorry, I'm been academic in crypto and our community has failed in addressing this problem. It has been completely ignored. There's fewer than 10 papers. So we need more construction, more designs, more crypto analysis. And I'm talking with academic people to solve this. Maybe the biggest problem, in my point of view, is the technology dependency. The CPUs, GPU of today will be completely different from the ones in 10 years. So you have to anticipate advances technology and design submissions appropriately. For example, today you might want to optimize for AVX2 or AVX 512, uses crazy instructions, 512-bit registers. But the more you optimize for Intel, the less you optimize maybe for AMD or ARM, the less you optimize for MIPS. It's really a trade-off between interoperability, efficiency, and future-proofness. I have no clue how to address the problem. Leakage resilience. Leakage is essentially side channel leaks from timing, electromagnetic emanations, everything you can imagine. For example, if you support passwords of any length, it will be slower to hash a password of 1,000 characters than a password of 2 characters. But this leaks information on the side of the password. Presumably you will not need to support very long passwords. Maybe 100 is probably good enough. Cache timing attacks, if you make specific patterns of memory accesses, if that depends on the password, and if an attacker can monitor this, he will get information on the password. And similarly, if the actual values that are stored in memory, if they leak information on the password, then you might have to wipe the memory after using it. And for some reasons, you may not want to do this. So I think that there are issues to address, not strong requirements, but you have to think about it when you design a password hashing scheme. Then many people tell me, yeah, but you hash this on the server, why just not hashing on the client? And then you don't have to send the password in clear text, or whatever it means. But if you hash on the client side, you force people with maybe very lightweight hardware to do heavy computations. So you have the problem of performance consistency. So again, it probably depends on your application whether you can afford doing this or not. Maybe you can share the effort between the client and the server. So again, many questions. Some people come to me and tell me, yeah, but if you do everything on the server, it will be much easier to DOS the server by doing many connection attempts. Yes, so some people at Google tell me, well, who cares, we have enough power. I said, but you are Google, okay. So maybe for you, if you run your own small web service, it might be an issue. But again, that might be addressed by standard anti-DOS defenses like red limiting and other techniques. Funny updatability. Let's say you have a server that you purchased 5 years ago. You're going to purchase a new one in 2 years. It will be much faster, but you want to hash the function within the same time. So you have to modify the password hashing scheme to make more iterations. But then you have to ask each user to make a fresh login to get their actual password, so to store the new hash function. It would be much better if you could just take the hash and take some auxiliary value and directly compute the better hash from the lower hashes. There's probably more intelligent techniques to do this, but you have to think about it to find something better. Okay. And finally, I'll finish some crazy ideas. So I chatted to some people about what can we do something better than password hashing, not just hashing, but password hashing method or schemes or whatever. And I came up with the idea of making functions that depend on the password and the salt. So you will use a completely different algorithm for each function. And if you start thinking about it, you come up with a conclusion that this is somewhat equivalent to creating a VM and a bytecode generator that produces code that always run within the same time in the same memory. I think it's an interesting idea that might be excellent for some application, that might be very bad for some others, but I really would like to see more work in this direction. Another crazy idea is security through obesity by Jimmy Spillman. The idea is to pollute the database with fake hashes that do not correspond to any real user. So first, if the attacker compromises the machine, he has to exfiltrate maybe gigabytes of data, which might take some time, and then he will have no clue of which hashes are interesting to break and which one are useless to break. So again, in some applications, it might be a bit overkill. I presume that this might work, but this needs a lot of changes in your architecture. Okay. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. you.